It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I thank you all so much for coming back to the school to hear about some of these big issues. So I think it's entirely appropriate we start with Brexit. I think I'm going to be saying that at every annual reunion for the next few years. And that's essentially my main takeaway on Brexit, which is it's going to be uncertain for some time. So the only certainty about Brexit is uncertainty. So there's a few reasons for this and has implications for how businesses ought to be planning for the exit of the European Union of Britain. The first thing is, of course, the European mantra is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So when we talk about having certainty, as in what will the relationship with the European Union be after Brexit, we are not going to know that until pretty much the very last possible minute. In other words, the transition period, which is currently being negotiated, extends until the end of 2020. But that is a very short period of time to resolve the current issues around the Irish border, EU national rights. I think we're mostly the way there, and on the budget, and before we can even start talking about what the trade relationship is going to be. So you're not going to be able to really negotiate a trade deal within a couple of years. So the implication for that is more uncertainty, and particularly, I think for businesses, it means it's difficult to know what this transition period is supposed to be transitioning to. And so it's fine to say we're going to have a couple of years or 18 months to plan out how you're going to move to this new regime. But is the new regime going to be the Canada model, the Norway model, the Turkey model? Will it be a hybrid? Will it be a version of all of those things? What will happen to supply chains? What's going to happen to regulation? What's going to happen to access? Will the UK get to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries, which is something that is not possible if the UK were to be in a customs union through a customs agreement with the EU. So I think all of these things mean, in terms of scenario planning, I think businesses do have to plan for, I don't want to say the worst case scenario because I think that's too pessimistic, but I think you do have to plan for what those particular models will mean for your business. So let me kind of spell out what these different outcomes might be. But remember what I just said about the only certainty is uncertainty. So I can give you what has been done, but there's always a sense that maybe a bespoke deal could be done for the UK. That is what politicians, is their job. And there is this saying, politics is the art of the possible, but sometimes I'm starting to change this quote to politics seems like the art of the impossible because we keep getting promised sort of very difficult, untried things, but let's not be pessimistic about it. So the possible outcomes are really, there's four possible outcomes. So the very first one is we leave the EU with no deal, and that means we trade on WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules. That will impose a cost in terms of especially supply chains, because we go from tariff-free trade in goods to paying tariffs on traded goods. And for a lot of just-in-time manufacturing, that's going to have implications, and we are cut off from access to the services sector within the EU. That's a state that may not last for a long time. My guess is that would be the state until a free trade agreement is done, but that is a possibility. So I think that's something, it's worth brushing up on your WTO rules, membership rules for Britain. The second possible model is a customs agreement. So this is because of the Irish border, trying to maintain as frictionless border as possible is putting the customs agreement back on the table. Customs agreement is what the EU has with Turkey, which is if you agree to have a common external facing tariff, then you're in a customs agreement. It facilitates the trade of goods across the border. But the thing about a customs agreement is Turkey is not allowed to do its own free trade deals because it has to have the same external facing tariff as the EU. And one of the benefits of Brexit is that Britain would get to do its own free trade deal. So this, I think, places the Irish border against the desire to do free trade deals, pretty much diametrically opposed to each other. And the other thing to say about this model is Turkey has a hard border with the EU. So it wouldn't actually make it, we wouldn't remove the border because trade is not just about taxes, it is also about standards and regulations. And so if you're not in the single market, then goods which are traded have to be checked. It could be done at source, pre-verified, but it just means you do have to have random checks or some type of infrastructure at the border. Can technology solve it? Possibly, but that technology won't be possible for years. So that's your second option. Your third option is the Norway or Swiss model, which is a version, or essentially they're countries which are non-EU countries within the single market. The border between, many of you will have seen this and crossed the border. The border between Switzerland and the EU, there's a border, but it's actually a pretty soft border. It's pretty frictionless. But being within the single market means that the UK would have to accept the 4 freedoms, including free movement of people. Switzerland wanted a modification of that to control migration. After a couple of years, they were defeated. Maybe with the noises which are coming from the continent, that might be possible to begin to change. But at the moment, as it stands, the Europeans have said very clearly that to be in the single market, unfettered access to the single market means accepting free movement of people. And that again goes against one of the government's red lines, which is the British government will control immigration. So that leaves us with the last model, which is the Canada model, which is just a proxy for a free trade agreement. The reason we use the Canada model is that it's deeper. When we economists say deeper, it means that it doesn't just pertain to tariffs. It actually gives Canada duty-free access for goods into the EU, and there's some access for the services sector. And Canada, of course, can do its own free trade deals and doesn't accept free movement of people. So in that sense, the Canada model meets the red lines, but let's be very clear. If you are a third country, which is what Canada is, you don't have the same deep integration of the EU single market that makes it the biggest economic bloc in the world. So Britain would become like Canada. Britain would become like any of the 80 or so countries which has a free trade agreement with the EU that has huge implications for supply chains and distribution chains, for which small frictions are very costly. So finally, we've had a lot of news coming from Airbus and BMW over the past couple of days that the lack of certainty means companies are making decisions probably this summer. Some financial institutions have already started to make plans because contingency plans take about a year to work through. All of the 4 models that I've described may not even be the final outcome. You could actually have a 5th model. So these contingency plans, I think, are a reflection of a lack of belief that there will be something concrete that's delivered by the end of 2020. And when we say contingency plans, we obviously mean moving more of the center of gravity into the continent. So without a clear direction as to what the British government ultimately wants and whether it's feasible for the Europeans to grant it, I think we are going to see more indications of companies really planning for the worst outcome. So I see quite a few worried faces, but you know, being a board director, I like it. We should worry and we should plan.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So I want to open it up to you guys and girls, and the question is, what are you already doing? So if you've got things you can share with what your business is doing in terms of trying to prepare and plan for this uncertainty. And of course you may have questions for Linda as well to dig a bit deeper into some of what she's shared with us already. So please raise your hand if you have a question or you want to share something, and we'll bring a microphone to you.
The obvious question, what do you think is going to happen? One of those four or something else?
Yeah. Well, the difficulty about predictions is that it's about the future.
Would you like to predict the past?
Economists struggle with that too. We revise data quite a lot, so we're not sure about the future. We're not really sure about the past. I think there will be a bespoke model. Would be my best guess at the moment. Even though the EU is very, very clear, they don't like cherry picking. Having looked at what's happened in the past with how the evolution of trade deals have come about and how the way the EU has dealt with the euro crisis, that's why I kind of started with that quote about politics, because everything is up for negotiation. So there are some possible permutations of what I've described. So these are, I know this is being recorded, but none of this is certain. So let me just make that very clear. So one of the options currently being debated is, can the UK do a free trade agreement just on goods and with the EU? So in other words, have the customs agreement for goods, being the single market for goods like Canada, tariff-free access for goods, but do its own free trade agreements on services, which is what Canada has basically. And if that were to happen, then you can begin to mitigate the problem with the Irish border and supply chains, but have freedom to set free trade agreements. They've said no to Turkey, who wanted to negotiate a FTA with the United States. They required Turkey to abide by TTIP, which was the EU-US free trade agreement, which has gone nowhere, it's stalled. But the UK is not Turkey. And so that would be one possible outcome. But the danger here is services and manufacturing is actually very hard to separate. Companies like Rolls-Royce make more money servicing their engines than actually making their engines. So once you start to go down this road, it's not clear how well you can separate the two, but Canada is an example of their willingness to grant duty-free access for goods, but separate out services. So that's one possibility. The second way to resolve the single market free movement issue is that there's a huge amount of pressure within the European Union over migration. So the Schengen area, which is a free travel area, the UK is not a part of anyways. The Schengen area is under pressure because of refugee migration. So one of the compromises that Merkel and Macron have come up with just 2 days ago is Merkel wants to control the movement of migrants at the German border through looking at whether they first registered with another country. So if you're coming by boat and you've stopped in Italy or France, and that's where you first registered, then you try to go to Germany, there's talk of basically moderating free movement. The danger with this is, of course, once you start down this road, the Schengen area doesn't really look free. And then the next step is what Macron has been saying about France, which is they don't want low-wage workers from Eastern Europe coming into France and taking the jobs of French people. So you can see this immigration debate is very politically uncertain at the moment. So one of the proposals that I've heard from the continent is you have free movement of people with jobs. So that is a big modification of the current system. And in theory, the current system allows for that only to the extent you can move wherever you want. But if you don't have a job after 3 months, you should probably, or just move on. And so, but that's very difficult to track within a system which doesn't check Europeans and Brits when they travel. So, but if there was some policy around that which controlled migration, that would be a fudge, which could allow the UK to be within the single market and accept a modified version of this free movement. It would be a compromise of sorts, I think, which would first have to stem from the European Union doing it themselves. So it doesn't look like so politically, I think it needs to come from there. And I think those are probably, to me, what's being discussed, which would be a fifth kind of model. What I think wouldn't work at the moment is mimicking or imitating the current arrangement, which is, is my interpretation of the government's stance at the moment. They want the benefits of the single market and the benefits of the customs union, but not to be in either. I think economically that makes sense, but politically, I think it just, I think there has to be some compromise of the Europeans. So I just don't think that would be very likely. I don't want to make everyone too depressed about Brexit. So let me just say one thing about the UK's trading relationships with the rest of the world, which might be something to think about for the future as to where Britain could be positioned if the European Union, this drags on for a long time, which is very likely. So the world in terms of trade is driven by two trends: services trade and digital trade. Neither of these things are actually very well opened up in terms of markets or regulated. So in other words, services, which is what most of us do in this country and actually in the EU, 70% of GDP of the European Union is services. In Britain, it's over 3/4. So services trade is not nearly as open as manufacturing trade, but that's one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing area of trade. So liberalizing the services market is something the Europeans and the Americans under Obama had begun to talk about, which is TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, launched in 2013. If that was revived, and the British government has said they support it, plus, I think, greater support of digital trade. E-commerce now accounts for 1 in 8 of every cross-border transaction. These are huge opportunities that countries, I think, ought to be more focused on. And I think that's something that it's because we're now looking at trade more deeply. I think Britain could take a lead here, and there are some indications that Britain will. And where could Britain position itself in such a world? Britain could become a global trading hub. And what I mean by this specifically is major economies around the world do not have free trade agreements with each other. The United States doesn't have a free trade agreement with the EU or China. China does have a free trade agreement with any really major economy. They're the biggest economies in the world. So a country that has a free trade agreement with major economies that don't have free trade agreements with each other is in a preferential position. So for instance, Mexico has an FTA with the EU. American company that produces cars in a Mexican factory to sell to the EU pays 0% tariffs. An American factory exporting directly to the EU pays a 10% tariff under WTO rules. Canada now has a very similar preferential agreement with the EU. So if the UK were to have a free trade agreement with countries that don't have free trade agreements with each other, and given the UK's specialization in services, this fast-growing area, and being the world's 5th or 6th biggest economy, it depends on sterling. France is sometimes bigger than we are. We don't like to talk about it. Then Britain could be in a preferential position. But I'm not suggesting, by the way, it's easy to do free trade deals with these countries. I'm just suggesting, as an aim, these are the 3 sort of areas that Britain could focus on. But let's be clear, it's very difficult to do free trade agreements with major economies. That's why they don't have many of them. President Trump likes to win. It's going to be hard to do a free trade deal with a guy who likes to win. That's just going to be tough. And America is focused on renegotiating or pulling out of FTA, so there's not a lot of capacity to do new deals. China, let's face it, I mean, there's a joke around China in terms of how challenging it is to do a deal with them. The Chinese like to say, if you do a deal with us, it's a win-win situation. That normally means that China wins twice. And so...
Thank you. Yeah, and let's take one more, a comment, or yeah, go ahead.
If you just wait for the microphone so it picks up on the...
Thank you.
Beyond Brexit, what do you think that is the biggest risk for UK or region? Corbyn? Think that it's...
Sorry, is it?
Corbyn?
Corbyn.
Election. Because a lot of debate has been done about if Theresa May was going to survive this process.
Yeah.
And we saw in the latest week that she lost some ground.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? Do you think that Corbyn could win? Because from my personal view, someone like Corbyn winning the election is a huge risk, more than Brexit for this country. This is my humble.
So just to build on that for everybody to make sure you heard, so the question is around what happens if Jeremy Corbyn, who's currently the leader of the opposition here in the UK, was to become Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn is significantly further to the left than recent Labour Party leaders or Prime Ministers.
I think Corbyn is picking up an anti-status quo move that we've seen in lots of countries. So I think there is, there's momentum behind him. Momentum is the grassroots group that supports Corbyn, my little play on words. I think the policies of the Labour Party in terms of where they stand currently may not be the policies should they win the general election, because the Labour Party itself is quite divided. The parliamentary Labour Party, I think, has very different views than the grassroots and probably the current leadership of the Labour Party. And as we've seen with the Conservatives, when you have that kind of split within the parliamentary party, policies are actually very difficult to get agreement on and to put forward. So, for instance, one of the challenges with Brexit that I mentioned a moment ago is the British government doesn't actually have a united view on what it wants, which makes negotiations quite challenging. So the Brexit cabinet at the moment has 11 people, and the last appointment to the Home Secretary voted against the Prime Minister on her preferred policy for the customs problem, the customs goal. And I just wouldn't rule out that being also the case in Labour, knowing how deep the division is within the party. So I think for me, the biggest threat to the UK is Brexit, because it upends decades of trading arrangements deeply embedded in supply chains. And I think that will be very disruptive, regardless of the outcomes that I described, which will be years in advance. And I guess the biggest economic challenge actually for Britain is underneath all of this, Britain has a productivity problem. So productivity is slow, and it's not clear why, and wages are low as a result. So that combination, I think, in terms of worrying about whether Britain can revive productivity, is probably at the moment one of the benefits of the current focus on the economics of the country, because it's putting a lot more emphasis on investing in productivity and trying to raise it. And so Britain has very competitive sectors, especially around the services sector. So I think, but there are going to be other areas that just don't seem as competitive within services and manufacturing. We need to get to the bottom of it and work out why. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is services, which is what Britain mostly produces, is very hard to measure. So I sort of wonder the productivity issue is being overstated, because we're not really measuring the true output of what most of us do, which is work in an office. But there's also, I think, so services is also badly measured. It could be the other way. So in other words, how many of you have been to meetings which are an utter waste of time? Okay. Oh, really? Not all hands? Okay. I need to work where you work. But there have been meetings which are great, brainstorming and all of that. So most of us work in an office. The output is badly measured. So I wonder if maybe the productivity problem isn't that large. But if you don't measure output appropriately, you can't pay people well, because you're not really matching up productivity with wages. So low wages is, I think, something that has to be tackled for the country to have a healthy future. And then the final thing about productivity is, can any invention today raise productivity? So Britain is not alone. All advanced economies have slowing productivity. So the Bank of England did this bit of research which found, so we all have smartphones. They show this chart where the number of people with smartphones is going up and productivity is going down. And so, can the technologies of today raise productivity? And this is a global problem. So to me, that's the key problem for the UK.
Okay. Any other? Yeah, go ahead, Lisa. Yeah. the microphone will come, coming up that way. Perfect.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your insights, which are very helpful. And my question is another scenario for coming back to the Brexit topic. Can it be a no Brexit in the end? Can this be reverted? Because there has been some discussions starting 1 year ago. I think it was the president of Malta raising the point. Then there was one guy in the European Union, and a German guy, which I don't remember the name properly. There was also Gordon Brown, and there has been some voices, some rumors about can this be reversed? There should be a second referendum to make people decide whether they want to live in the deal that eventually will end up being. And then also there has been blames to Mr. Putin, as we try always to find the blame on him when we don't know how to deal with or get out of a situation. So it seems there are some ways or trying to get out of this situation in the most easy way or the most diplomatic one. Can this be possible?
Technically, it's possible. Apparently, if we just write a letter to Brussels and said, "Never mind, we changed our mind. We're not out yet," that would be okay. But I think, I guess the question is for a second referendum to be called, I think it will require that, because I think where the current debate is in the UK is the first referendum is it would have to be overturned by second referendum. So the question is whether or not any of the current parties have the desire and the support to to push for a second referendum. Because I don't see a second referendum happening because MPs have decided they're going to do this. I think they're going to ask for a referendum. I think for the Tories and Labour, that's not something which is they're going to do. The Lib Dems have said they would call for a second referendum, but they don't have a lot of votes in Parliament. So I think this outcome politically, I think is not that likely. And the other reason I say that is, a moment ago we were talking about some of the legislation that tried to move through the Parliament this week. One of the amendments, if you guys ever watch, have you ever seen Yes Minster, which is this great comedy? So if you watch the amendment that went through on the EU withdrawal bill, there was an amendment about giving MPs a meaningful final vote. So the amendment, which was proposed in the Lords, and then which passed in the Lords, was passed back to the Commons, because it has to be passed in the Commons for it to have legislative value. So if you watch the person who announced it, it was something like the Lords Amendment, which went to the Commons. The amendment to the Lords Amendment in the Commons Amendment has now been returned to the House of Lords for further discussion on the amendment. And so basically, it was thought that the government had conceded, made enough concessions that the rebels who put forward this amendment to have a statutory requirement that a final meaningful vote is required was essentially was conceded without needing to enshrine it in statute. That sounds confusing. It's meant to be. It's gone out back to the House of Lords. But basically, it's Parliament. If Parliament wants to have a say, it can have a say. It can always amend any legislation that comes through. So if it has a final say on the deal, and the deal isn't economically as good, then could that be the trigger for a push to have a second referendum? Maybe. But I think by the time you get to this point of the final deal, it's probably not going to be that soon. So I think that's the other possibility, the avenue where it could happen. Someone did joke that it would be a very British thing to say, when we said we wanted to leave, we'll just never mention it again and hope that other people forget.
Thank you, Linda. Well, I just broadened the question out. Oh, I cannot stop you, so go ahead.
It's just a final answer, right? What if the deal is not that advantageous and it's having kind of the mayor has been saying that London in itself is a cluster? Would it be possible that if it's not advantageous to UK, that some of the technicalities of London, like the financial services, could be protected? Tailor-made deal just for London itself?
Did everybody hear that? So it's about the idea that perhaps, because there's a very different viewpoint, generally speaking, in London and parts of the southeast, that somehow or other London or parts of the southeast, particularly around the financial sector, somehow cut and carve out a different deal in some way to the rest of the country. I think that was the question. Yeah.
So there are a couple of things that the Mayor of London has suggested. One is, yes, I think having treating London as a looking at the ways in which London can have preferential access to the EU. And the second thing I think you mentioned was having a visa scheme for London. And I'm not sure the second one would really work, but I think at least in terms of visas, and I don't think highly skilled workers such as those in the financial sector in London or elsewhere have to worry. It would be, I don't think in terms of movement of professionals that will be that big of an issue. I think mostly the problems around free movement will come from lower skilled workers. So I think in that sense, we're all used to working wherever we need to. I think it will be more administration, but I don't think that would be an impediment. I think the more difficult thing to do is to have financial services be given preferential access. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is it's a very competitive business, and France and other European countries are very keen to take as much as they can in order to build up their own bases. So I think politically there's going to be pushback from the continent. And the second thing is cherry picking. So if financial services get preferential treatment, then why wouldn't aerospace get special treatment? Airbus, I think, has said explicitly, if the UK wants to be a highly competitive, high-tech economy, then you need to protect industries like aerospace, then car manufacturers, steel industry. Then in that case, once you sort of go down this list, I think it's going to be politically difficult for the government to do this. In fact, if you start to go down the list and give every industry preferential treatment, we may as well not leave, because everybody will have preferential treatment if we were in the single market, which is why I think this side of it is probably more certain than others. They've already said very clearly that London will lose passporting rights, so international banks based here will not have the same access to the EU single market, and we've already seen movement on that basis. So,
Thank you. Let's just broaden it out. We have touched on this already, but look at the whole sort of trade war scenario that is evolving, driven particularly, I think, by President Trump. And what you see as some of the potential implications for global trade and for all the different regions in this emerging war?
Yeah, so there's probably quite a lot of negative implications to come from what we're experiencing at the moment. There's already been, I think, quite a lot of uncertainty around tariffs and tax regimes. So let me lay this out in terms of how this can escalate into a full-blown trade war. The first is the tariffs which are now being levied are probably not allowed under the World Trade Organization rules. The United States is claiming a national security exemption for the taxes that it's imposing on steel and aluminium. I think that's a stretch in terms of national security. And so that is probably why there's preemptive retaliatory tariffs which have come from the EU, from China, and other places. So I think this is already adding to the cost of business, and it's every week there seems to be a new level of tariffs which are being announced on more goods. So another $200 billion on Chinese goods were announced. President Trump tweeted he's going to impose a 20% tariff on European cars. because remember, he doesn't like the fact there's more Mercedes in New York and not a lot of American cars in Berlin. And so this is an area he's not liked for a long time. And so the
Very different cars.
so I think these tariffs are taxes. If you're going to impose this on this amount of goods and there's retaliation, it's just going to add to everyone's cost, and this is obviously extremely damaging in and of itself. Obviously, the better way to reduce your trade deficit is not to put a tax on imports, but to sell more exports. So it actually means the better way to do this would be to revive TTIP, try to negotiate a greater opening of the services sector in the world, which is America's strength. American economy is mostly services, like Britain's, and it's the world's biggest exporter of services. So that would be a better way of trying to reduce the trade deficit in goods and services than what's currently being done. But I told you I would lead you through how we get to a trade war. So here's the next phase. The next step is Steve Mnuchin, who's the Treasury Secretary, has been asked by the President to look at restricting investment from China. But as we've seen with the steel and aluminium tariffs and these other tariffs, what starts with China tends to be broadened out by the President. So there's always a danger this isn't just restricted to China. So once you start to restrict investment and there'll be retaliation, you're not affecting supply chains where companies decide to invest because there's going to be government restrictions on normal distribution supply chain decisions. So the likes of Apple may not be able to freely produce where they wish around the world, including in China, because of what's happening. So once you start to affect supply chains, this is deeply damaging because it's hard to reverse. Investment isn't like a tax where you could just decide tomorrow there's no tariff. Investment decisions have sunk costs and they take time. So that would be the second escalation. The final bit where I think we'd really be in a trade war is that the United States disregards the ruling of the WTO. The EU has brought the US before the WTO to say these tariffs are not allowed. Sovereign nations are only bound by rules they wish to be bound by. So the United States, despite the fact that it started the WTO, it's one of the founders of the WTO, the rules of the global trading system are based on American standards and rules. If America were to thumb its nose at the WTO and say, you ruled against us, we don't care. And President Trump has complained about the WTO as being ineffectual and threatened to pull out. That, I think, would mean a massive disruption to the way that world trade is done. And that, to me, would be where we get to. That's what I would say in a full-blown trade war. And I think the final thing to say about this is that opening up markets is obviously difficult. So one of the complaints that lots of businesses have had about China for quite a long time is that it's a fairly closed market, especially in services. China knows it's in its interest to open up more because it needs competition to develop the services sector, much like it opened up manufacturing to develop that sector in the 80s and the 90s. So it's just very slow in doing so because services is dominated by state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. But if America, through this tactic, could open up the Chinese market, that would be one benefit for the world economy. But that's a very high-risk strategy to do that. It's a bit like a modern-day gunboat diplomacy. If you don't open up, we're going to tax you even more. And actually, the interesting thing about this latest round of tariffs with China is China's been doing tit for tat. So the U.S. has imposed $50 billion, another $200 billion, which is about half of everything China sells to the U.S. But China only imports $160 billion from the U.S. So even if it wanted to impose $250 billion, it doesn't have enough to impose. So this is, I'm not sure, I can't believe we're actually talking in these terms. This is really quite worrying. But anyway, so that's one thing. But the EU is not China. Canada and the EU and Mexico are not China. So the average tariff rate in the EU is 3.1%. In America, the average tariff rate is 2.4%. So it's fairly close. And so I think this tactic being used against the Europeans, against the Canadians, doesn't really make a great deal of sense. It's not the way to get more American cars into Berlin. I think we all decide what kind of cars we want to buy. I think that's probably the bit of the of this complaint that's not been discussed enough. So America, so I think that's where I see the worst case scenario going. But hopefully we won't get there.
Any thoughts, reactions, questions around the potential of the global trade war?
Do you think that Trump will gonna go for service? Because so far, as far as I know, he just mentioned goods.
Yeah, I think he's very focused on the trade deficit and narrowly on goods. The trade deficit includes services. I don't think this is something that I don't think this is a big part of what he's considering, despite the fact that people like me have written about it, and but I think obviously the overall picture of the U.S. current account, which is the broadest measure of trade, which includes portfolio flows, that larger picture is much more sensible to focus on anyways, right? Because the current account deficit the United States have is actually reflective of America being a very attractive place to invest, American companies investing overseas. One of my colleagues here describes America as the world's biggest hedge fund. It can borrow very cheaply over the long term and make very profitable investments overseas. And so the current account deficit is a mixture of investment flows, dollar being the reserve currency, so there's a lot of demand for U.S. assets, as well as the trade balance, which is goods and services. So this overall mix of where the U.S. Current account position sits has actually served America pretty well, in that American consumers benefit from a strong dollar. American sells its debt cheaply, imports are cheaper, America has grown well on the back of it, and I think all of that doesn't mean you shouldn't look at what's happening in trade and goods. You shouldn't ignore if the current account deficit gets too big. You shouldn't ignore if Americans consume more than they save. But this current discussion is so narrow that actually the bigger picture of where America sits in the world is more important. But there was a report of, do you remember President Trump? I think he said on Twitter that he thought the strong dollar was hurting America's exports. And then the markets went, what? And apparently this is news, it was reported, I think some of in the newspapers, that he then rang up one of his friends and said, so just remind me, do we want a strong dollar or not? And I think he came out the next day and said, it's okay. And so yeah.
So we've just got, we've got a couple of minutes left, and you very wisely avoided predicting the future, possibly even avoided predicting the past. But are there lessons that we can learn from the past? Because some of what we're going through and we're seeing in some of these trends, the world has been through before. Is there hope in looking back as to how these things and how wise heads perhaps have prevailed in the end?
Yeah, I think there is. Thank you very much for the prompt. I've written a book called The Great Economist, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today. It actually looks at all the lessons we can draw from history, because the issues today are not exactly the same as what they were, but there are similarities. You know that phrase, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So the issues that we're looking at now, this backlash against globalization, facing a slow growth future, these are all issues that we've actually seen before, and there are lessons that we can take away. So for instance, one of the biggest changes to how capitalist systems work came about after the very first Great Depression, which was not in the 1930s. It was actually in the latter part of the 19th century. The Long Depression was known as the Great Depression of the 19th century. And that was when unemployment appeared for the first time in the dictionary. So after this massive decline, which nobody really saw coming, well, that part will not surprise you, there was a backlash against the capitalist system, a backlash against globalization. And that was when capitalism itself was transformed away from what Adam Smith had devised in the 18th century into a welfare state capitalism, which the late Victorians at the time, who were focused on the deserving poor and poverty, started to incorporate some of the challenges coming from socialists and communists into how a market-based system would work. And then this became the welfare state after World War II, and that seemed to have won the day for the most of the post-war period. And certainly by the end of the Cold War, at the end of the 1980s, there was a sense that this system was superior to the socialist system and certainly to the communist system. But now, as we've just had another great collapse in the market system, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, there's a re-examination of all of these things, the status quo that I've mentioned several times. But whenever you have this kind of re-examination of how the market economy should work, this is the opportunity to reshape it. This is the opportunity to make it more fit for our times, for the 21st century, which is why when I was discussing what we could do in terms of trade and globalization, looking ahead to services, to how the digital economy works, I think there's lots of reasons to think the current system hasn't worked, but maybe it's also outdated. Maybe we should be rethinking which markets to open. We should also be rethinking how to raise innovation and productivity, which are all things that deliver economic prosperity and gives people confidence in the system. And I think this is now a golden opportunity for all of us to have that discussion and to move our system forward. So I see this as a challenging time, but actually with all this interest in economics, I think this is actually a very good time to think about shaping the world that we live in. And I think all of you, being interested in these issues is a very, very good start. And I suppose my one warning is about economics in general is I think one of the challenges with it is it's to have this discussion widely, I think will take some effort because economics is not the most appealing subject generally, I think it's fair to say. My favorite quote about economics comes from the former US Congressman Dick Armey. He said, "Economics is the science of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language that you can't understand." So I think but this is with all the focus on Brexit, on trade wars, on the world economy, on the digital economy, this is the time to have that conversation.
Linda, thank you very much.
Thank you.